Welcome again to this 4-part holistic weight loss webinar series. You already know the conventional approach to weight loss through restrictive diets and calorie counting doesn't work. And the purpose of these webinars is to provide you with real holistic solutions that do work. And as you probably also know, my coaching team and I are about to embark on a very intense private coaching program called the Ultimate Coaching Experience. And since myself and all of my staff work one-on-one with everybody involved, it's going to occupy the bulk of our time for a while. So we decided to make this sort of free webinar series available to everyone before we get started and before we kind of disappear for a while. And today's class is the second in this series, and it's called Heal the Past and Lose Weight. And I'm very pleased to be joined by my friend and colleague, Paul North. Paul North is an Australian registered psychologist and mindfulness meditation teacher with a diverse history that covers disability, mental health, business, and elite sport. Paul's an extremely active member of the Gabriel Method coaching team, specializing in helping people overcome past trauma. He's also a Gabriel Method success story. After reading the Gabriel Method, Paul lost 12 kilograms or 26 pounds and is inspired to teach this approach to all of his clients. So I'm very pleased to have Paul here. And so my first question, this is a question I'm going to be asking you, is how can the past, or why does the past lead to weight gain, like past trauma? How does past trauma lead to weight gain?
Well, I suppose it's fair to say that not all trauma experiences lead to weight gain, but it's clear that there definitely is a relationship between significant weight gain in a lot of people and that have a history of either a traumatic incident or some level of ongoing trauma. We certainly know that just a single traumatic incident can lead to architectural changes in the brain, and that sort of incident, those architectural changes, especially going to affect an area of the brain that's what's actually called the amygdala, which is the part of the brain which is kind of like our smoke detector in the kitchen. So if it's all working well, and it just goes off when there's a fire. But in people who've suffered some trauma, that amygdala, it becomes hypersensitive, and so it goes off, when you make the toast, and it's always going off, and it's always sort of on red alert. Which, pretty soon it's going off all the time, keeping the person in a state of hyperarousal, as if there's a real danger that's always present. So this type of fear causes the body to continually release a range of stress hormones, which are amazing chemicals if they're required just once in a while, like if you're getting chased by a wolf pack. But if they're on all the time, the body quickly starts to suffer the consequences. And one of those consequences is an increased propensity to store weight. So that's certainly one of those relationships between trauma and weight gain.
Yeah, I think that's an excellent observation. And what can happen in that whole area, that amygdala, and I love that analogy that it's the smoke detector. And people typically describe the amygdala as the seat of aggression and fear. So if you're having any kind of fearful experience, that amygdala is going to be pumping out stress hormones, particularly cortisol. But what happens is, the more the amygdala gets activated, then the faster the trigger. So you get into this kind of hyper-vigilant fear state all the time, which I think sometimes trauma can cause. Does that make sense?
Definitely.
Yeah. Now you talk about there's different types of trauma. So you talk about simple traumas, and as opposed to complex traumas. I'm wondering if you can tell me a little bit about what you mean by that.
Yeah, simple traumas are pretty much one-off events. I mean, and this is an interesting thing with trauma is that we all have a different level of sensitivity. Some person may actually experience just a single car accident, and that can be enough to actually create some really big problems. Another person, it might be the second or the third time something like that happens. But in essence, a simple trauma is pretty much a one-off event. Or it might be an assault. It could even be when you're a kid, and Dad for the first time slapped you, across the face because of something you'd said, and he just had a bad day at work. But that particular moment, because he'd never done anything to you before in your whole life, and he was like, he was up on the pedestal. He was kind of like God. That can be the moment. A complex trauma, on the other hand, is an abuse that occurs over a long period of time, so there's multiple ongoing episodes. Now, look, it might have since stopped, or it might not. So in the case of, say, domestic violence, we sometimes have people who who are still in that really risky situation, or they've moved out, or they've had a period of perhaps even sexual abuse as a child, and they're now adults who left home. But there's a number of events that occurred over a period of time. So there's lots of layers to it, and that's what we call a complex trauma.
Obviously you and I deal with trauma and abuse all the time in our business because that's what we see because it causes weight gain so much of the time. And I can give in talking about simple and complex traumas as you're describing it, I can give you really good examples of just from real life experiences of clients that I've had. For example, one person, she was pretty carefree until she was in her mid-30s, and she's been walking down the street. She's been living in a city for her whole life. One day she was walking down the street, she got mugged. And
right.
Ever since, it was a one-off event, and ever since that, as she's walking down the street, whenever someone looks at her funny, she's on alert. The amygdala, the smoke alarm, is pumping out stress hormones, and she started putting on weight. And then another example, and this came for me when I first was on television here in Australia. Some lady called me and told me how when she was a 10-year-old little girl, she had a babysitter. It was actually a female babysitter that was abusing her. And this went on for 3 years, and the whole time that she was being abused, she was gaining weight. And what's interesting in this case is that she ended up gaining so much weight that the abuser stopped abusing her. The abuser lost interest. And so in that instance, it left such an indelible impression in her between weight and safety that she had been trying to diet for 30 years, obviously, and nothing was happening. The minute she'd lose some weight, she'd gain it right back.
Yeah, and
so,
the really powerful,
yeah.
like I said, the really powerful key word that you use there, which is the word that's coming up in so many scientific fields, neuroscience, interpersonal neurobiology, is safety.
Yeah.
And this body that we have, it's the most amazing machine, and its sole purpose is to try and keep us safe. And the body has all these different ways of actually doing that. So, for example, there's another little mechanism that's in this process which doesn't help us if we're putting on weight. And that is the very act of chewing it activates one of the vagal nerves, and it actually creates a sense of safety. And if you think back to being a baby, when a baby needs support and it's crying, the mother puts that baby on the breast. One of the neural mechanisms which gets activated is the sense that the baby feels safe, and it's to do with this little chewing momentum that goes on in the mouth. And so we do that stuff now, and that's part of this relationship about comfort food, is that the act of chewing can actually help us to feel safe.
That's brilliant. Paul, I've been doing this for years now, and you and I have been working together for at least a year or two, and I've really never made that connection, but that's brilliant. I mean, when the baby is crying, they want to be nursed, and that act of chewing, suckling is comforting, and so as we're all grown up here and we're living complex grown-up lives, but there's still that primal kind of like innate need to be safe, to be loved, and it can lead to this, and it can lead to this need to chew. That's amazing. So let's talk about kind of like the next logical question. So we're having trauma. It's making us feel stressed. It's making us feel unsafe. It's pumping out all these stress hormones. How does that lead to actually eating? What causes that?
Well, so how does that actually lead to eating? Well, as we just mentioned, that drive then arises. I suppose another way to look at it is the brain. One of the brain's roles is to also always regulate our emotional state. And so it's going to do that through lots of different ways. One of the ways is going to be by going for something to eat. So we go back to how do we keep the person safe? How does that brain take steps to actually help the person feel safe? So if chewing is one way, it's going to actually activate that. Sometimes it's, we see with kids, because they're so hooked into computer games can become a way of regulating their attentional focus to help them to settle. So that's his brain's primary goal, is to try and regulate. So then it leads to, there are other aspects of this too. where we've got a bullying situation or a sexual abuse situation, the mind is basically driving that body to put space between themselves and the attacker, or themselves and the thing that's dangerous. So by increasing the person's girth, by increasing their size, that's exactly what they're doing. So the person is driven to actually eat because there's a comfort cycle that comes back out of that, and psychologically it increases their sense of safety through either regulation or through increasing their size, giving them a perceived sense of escape from the trauma that's occurring.
Yeah. So go ahead. I'm sorry, Paul. Keep on.
No, that's it. That's kind of mechanisms that are going on in the brain.
Yeah. So this idea, number one, that famine, that when you're feeling fear, it could be the result of your body could interpret as a famine, is certainly a very important one. And this one that you talk about creating space between an unsafe world. In my experience, I would say that is the biggest cause of weight gain when you've suffered an abuse, and when your abuse is when your weight gain is chronic and extensive. That's the biggest cause of this feeling that somehow the weight is creating spaces, is keeping you safe. Yeah. So let's just talk a little bit more about this brain circuitry and how the brain processes traumatic experiences, so we can understand a little bit better what we can do about it.
Yeah. Well, really, there are three parts to the brain, sort of roughly speaking. There's a thing called the neocortex, which is the most sophisticated part of the brain. So this part that actually sits over our eyebrows, that holds all these amazing abilities like having intuition, compassion, being able to be empathic, being able to look ahead to the future and make plans relative to things that have happened to you in the past. It all comes from that part of the brain. And that's where a lot of your language skills and processing skills are. We also have this midbrain, which is this part which sits underneath it. That controls a lot of our feelings, including our fight or flight response. So that's what gets triggered. That's one of the things that gets triggered when we get into when we get into a fear state. Underneath that, we have this really basic, what we call the reptilian brain. That's really instinctual sort of responses originate. It manages heartbeat and breathing, all those really basic functions. But the other thing it handles is what's called the freeze response. Now, the freeze response is what happens when we actually encounter a fearful situation as being hopeless, and so we completely shut down. It's quite an interesting part of the equation, because most people only really understand the fight or flight component. But freezing for a mammal is actually quite a problematic state of arousal. It's the most sophisticated state of arousal for a reptile, but for a mammal, it's actually quite a dangerous one. The reason why is that when we freeze, when we go into that state, our brains require a lot of oxygen as mammals. And when we go into a freeze response, the level of oxygen actually drops. That's why reptiles can actually stay frozen. They can go underwater for periods of time because their brains require very small amounts of oxygen. So the whole purpose of the fight or flight response in a mammal is to stop them becoming frozen. So in actual fact, a panic attack is actually a beautiful adaptation, even though it's actually socially unacceptable and problematic for a person. It actually does the amazing thing from a neurological perspective of keeping that person out of the freeze response, which is not a good thing for mammals. Oh. Now, of course, we know that fight or flight response actually has a direct impact on those cortisol levels. So we've sort of, it's kind of tricky, this whole thing. We've got this real need for the brain to sort of keep us out of this freeze response, but in doing so, it increases the likelihood that we're going to actually put on weight if we're actually in that state all the time. Yeah. Because this sort of brain analogy, or this understanding this brain architecture, helps us to understand then what's the sort of best approaches to sort of dealing with these traumas. And that's why I kind of introduced those three parts there.
So this freeze response I'm just wondering, as I'm thinking out loud, in real, obviously the whole problem to me in the way trauma reacts to the body is that the trauma is obviously is a mental or emotional trauma. It's not happening outside the body, but the body's reacting to it as a physical trauma. So you've got this fight or flight thing where your heart's pumping so that you want to run away, even though maybe the stock market just dropped or you're in traffic, and it's got nothing to do with the actual thing that's going on. But this freeze response is interesting because I think, as you're telling me this, I think the freeze response is one of the things that can put on weight if that's your tendency. Because I sort of remember, when I was in New York, and something would happen that felt threatening, and that was, every 10 or 20 minutes during the day at least. My response was more of a freeze response. It wasn't a panic response. It wasn't a reactive response. Like I had a business partner that was very reactive. He would scream and yell and curse. He didn't have a weight problem. My response was more of a freeze response. I just sort of took it, which is literally the same response you would have if you were in a famine. If you were freezing or in a famine, you activate this freeze response. So I'm wondering if people that gain weight sometimes might have a tendency to activate this freeze response. What do you think?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, it is. It's and you can see it in lots of things in life. What is stage fright? What is getting the yips on the golf course? You actually can't putt. Or if you're an archer, you can't release, the actual bow. These are all evidence of the body becoming in such a state that it can't make a decision, it can't do anything. In fact, to go back to its neurological equivalent, is the body is actually preparing for death. I mean, basically what happens is you've got the wolf pack chasing us, and so we run quickly to so we have these high brain functions to say, right, I've got to get out of here. You drop into that mid part of the brain and you run to the tree. But you get to the tree and you can't actually do it. You can't get up into the branches and the wolf pack's getting closer. So the next stage is to actually fight. So you're still using that midbrain, still throwing everything you can. But then there's too many of them. So the next part is this freeze, and the body just starts to shut down in preparation for the inevitable. So of course, let's go back to the traffic. We've got 10,000 worries on our minds.
Well, hey, Paul, let me just interrupt you for 1 second because people are saying that you need to come in just a little bit louder. So if there's any way at all that you can just speak a little bit closer to the mic, a little bit louder, I think that would be really, really awesome.
Okay.
That sounded good right there. Whatever you're doing right now is sounding good.
Okay, the iPhone is pushed to my face.
Oh, that's beautiful. That's working. I'm sorry to have to push your iPhone to your face like that, but you're sounding really good right now. So you're talking about the analogy of driving to work and the freeze response.
Yeah, so, people have all had these experiences where they're so overwhelmed with stress that they just feel like they can't make another decision. They just can't do anything anymore. So they're really in a very basic, primitive part of the brain. It's a real survival part of the brain. And we all know, eating is part of those lowest sort of social survival sorts of things. In that point, that person is just not safe. They just don't feel safe.
Paul, I just want to say one thing. You and I have talked many, many times, and you've worked with many, many of my clients, but I have to say that you've just nailed it as far as I'm concerned. As I'm looking back at my life and people I've talked to, I've been in that chronic freeze response where it's just pure, life is pure survival. And when we were talking to Neil yesterday, it's like that. When you're carrying 50, try carrying 50 pounds around, for 5 minutes, and it becomes an effort. 100 pounds, 200 pounds, forget about it. People that are carrying weight, too much weight, are in pure survival mode, and that's exactly the mode that I was in when I was at my heaviest. It's just pure survival, and to me, all I wanted to do was eat, and I really felt like just sitting and eating was nurturing me.
Yeah, definitely. As I said, I go back to how do we make ourselves feel safe?
How do we make ourselves feel safe? All right, so let's talk about that. So really, the real question is. And this is really, to me, this speaks to the heart of the approach that we use is that, let's say, take me for an example, or so many of the listeners, we're in this chronic survival mode where it's just, life is just getting more and more overwhelming. We're carrying more and more weight. We go to the doctor, we go to the, in my case, Dr. Atkins or whatever, and it's all about food. Mm-hmm. Or exercise, or eat more, or eat less, do this. What but that's obviously not the issue. We have got to address some of these psychological and emotional experiences that are causing us to be in a chronic state of fear. So let's just talk about how we do that, some of the things that we do.
Yeah, and one of my clients, just towards the end of last year, just summed it up beautifully. So he came to the program, looking to lose weight. But after we talked for a little while, he said to me, he said, Paul, food has become the doorway to my emotional healing. He said, I came here just thinking it was about diet, but it's so not. It's become this journey, and so when people just focus on food, they just focus on calories in, calories out. It so can't be the solution, because it's such an amazing system with so many levels of integration, so what he said was just completely perfect. So yeah, the sorts of therapies. I mean, so when we talked about those sort of 3 levels of the brain, a lot of people are familiar with talk therapies, and they're certainly really effective for those sorts of issues that sort of can be resolved completely with a language-based interface. And that's going to be the case for some traumas as well, especially if they've happened. They're a simple trauma. They've happened later in life, but in essence, if something's actually happened earlier in life, especially before all our language functions are fully developed, and language is an amazing skill, and it takes ages to sort of develop all these skills, then we need other therapeutic modalities which actually are able to talk into the body, to get into that sort of deeper part before these language components. Plus the other thing is, so with trauma, it creates in the body such a reaction that the really good therapies honour both the body and the mind in coming to some level of resolution.
Yeah, go ahead.
No, you going to say something? Or?
Well, I know what we're about. We're about to sort of get into some really powerful therapies and healing and techniques, but I'm thinking before we do, this might be a really good time to take some questions, because, as I said, we've got 1,000 people online in all the different between all the different ways that we're logging on. We're getting lots and lots of questions. So I'm wondering if we can just bring Jenny on real quick, just ask a couple of questions, and then we can get into the real heart of the matter of what do we do about it. So Jen, Aaron, can we bring Jen on?
Yep, I'm here.
Hey Jenny,
Can
how you
hear me?
doing? Yep.
Hi, Jon. Yeah, hi, Paul. I'm sorry, there has been lots of comments to your talkings, Paul, but it's a bit hard to monitor them with the thousands of questions coming in. So I'll just give you a few that I think are a bit relevant. And one here says, my whole body hurts when I have suffered a hurt from someone else or a stress. Is this because my body is going into the freeze response? That's from Roz.
Wow. Okay, it's a little bit hard to sort of know just from that. My whole body hurts. So if it's a lot of people do carry pain, sometimes in joints, for example, when they've actually, suffered from trauma. And with the release of that trauma, that pain completely evaporates. I mean, literally, it can just dissolve, and suddenly something that's carried around for many, many years, surprisingly, is just not there anymore. Wow. Is it a product of the freeze response? It's kind of a little hard to know just on the basis of that.
Yeah.
Do you think it's possible, Paul? I might just that that maybe the person, Ross, has kind of suffered some trauma herself, and when she hears about other people's pain, she has sort of an empathetic reaction to that, and she's and it triggers her own pain, and maybe she feels so sensitive to the other person that actually triggers a pain response in her or a freeze response in her.
Definitely. Oh, definitely. I mean, if you think back to any situation which you think you might suffer a pain from, the body generally pulls back. The muscles contract. They get tight. Now you can think of if you're doing that a lot all the time. That in itself is going to actually lead to some level of pain. So yeah, definitely.
Okay. All right, Jen, you want to ask us another question?
And a different person in continuation said to that, does the freeze response cause direct cortisol levels raise also? That's from Ellen.
Generally, that comes from the fight or flight. So by the time we've actually dropped into the way this kind of works, it's it's pretty complicated neuropsych, but in essence, if we spend a lot of time in fight or flight, in that sense, that's a high level of arousal. That's required for a while before we start to go into that freeze response. Sometimes people will have a sense of we call it dissociation. Actually start to feel a little bit not here, a little bit unreal, a little bit floaty, a little bit out of their body. That's often the state that occurs, and then if we continue going, we would eventually faint. So if anybody in the listening has actually fainted, they actually have had the ultimate freeze response. Because it results in the blood pressure and it just dropping to such a level that they just lose their consciousness. And then the system reboots and they generally can be quite okay. But those cortisol levels, as I understand it, come from the midbrain and that state of fight or flight. So in order to get to freeze, they would have been in fight or flight, but they would have been in it for such a long time or such an ongoing period of time that they eventually got into that freeze response.
Okay. So Paul, so Jenny, actually
Yep.
we've got a lot of material to cover, but let's ask one more question right now, and then I'll bring you on again at the end.
Okay, Nikki says, so what would be going on in someone's head where there was a car accident and a bout with cancer that led to significant weight gain, not as a result of overeating or bad eating? How would I be feeling safer by being bigger?
This is a good question.
Okay, so once again, the brain is just looking to regulate. So we know, for example, if we go back to that baby suckling, we know that there's comfort in actually just the chewing action alone. And so anything that helps the brain to regulate, to help it to distract away and to feel safer, to lower those levels, it's going to find that behaviour. Now, if that behaviour happens to be eating, which it is in some people, then the natural consequence of that is going to be an increase in those calories and an increase in the sheer volume of food that they're actually consuming, which is going to then lead to the increase in weight at some point.
Yeah, that makes perfect sense. So, so Jenny, we'll bring you on just a little bit, but there's so much I want to cover right now, so much we both want to cover. So Paul, we were talking about how talk therapy can maybe be useful if the trauma is recent, but if it was a past trauma, then that's not going to be as effective. I wonder if you could sort of take off from there a little bit.
Sure. Yeah. So just to be straight up, all sort of talking therapy is actually good. Anything that you can get to actually explore and actually face and start to consider and reflect upon what's actually happening is a good and healthy process. To just try and battle on and keep it to ourselves is always a kind of tough path, because in actual fact our brain is a social organism. It's an amazing piece of hardware that actually learns through discussion and interaction with other people. I mean, the whole thing when we actually see little kids like looking in the mirror all the time, that's that brain checking itself out, always looking, always comparing, analysing. So any sort of opportunities that we can have to actually talk is still going to be good. But what we know is better, generally, in the areas of trauma, is something that actually incorporates or at least acknowledges the body component. And that's especially the case if what's happened to us has happened, either it's been very powerful, so there's actually been a very powerful, we call it visceral reaction, a reaction in the body, or it's something that's happened when we were younger, before our language centers were fully developed or in the process of developing. In those cases, then we need to do something that sort of acknowledges just more than just words.
Okay, so let's talk about that, Paula. Just to also, you probably have your phone pressed all the way up, but if you could just just press it up a little bit closer, or speak just a little bit louder. We just lost you on that last little bit. So we need to do something else. Let's talk about what we can do, and in particular the types of things that you do working with our clients and also in your own practice.
Yep. I mean, there's a number of sort of techniques. One of the things that I do is a thing called EMDR. It stands for eye movement desensitization and reprocessing. Really, basically, what it's founded on is that every single day when we go to bed, we process the day's events. That's how we actually do our learning. Actually, the brain's very clever. It takes out all the things that are useful, puts it in a file, and stores it away. Immediately was, junk, like, probably watching The Simpsons or something. It's going to put that in the bin and put it to the side. Now, even if you think, well, I never dream, we actually know that everybody does dream because everybody engages in this stuff called rapid eye movement. So during certain times of the night, if we were looking at their face, we'd see under their eyelids their eyes going back and forth. If we tap them on the shoulder at that moment and woke them up, they'd say, oh, wow, I was having a dream. That's this time of the night when they're processing the day's events. So when we have a trauma, the brain will start its process going to the day's event, and it'll get to that traumatic moment. And it'll be so stressful that it'll actually wake them up out of that sleep state. And so they won't ever get to process that memory all the way through. So it kind of the file gets made up, but it gets left open. And then what happens is, because it's not effectively processed, we get a thing called leakage. So let's say I was assaulted near a pub. I could be, some years later, I'm walking near a pub, and I can smell just that alcoholic smell that sort of wafts out from down near the doorways. And that can be enough to actually connect up with that leakage and give me a full-blown panic attack and revitalize that memory. So the process for EMDR is about helping the person to identify what we call the touchstone memories, the key event. Because sometimes it could be many, many years ago, and many layers of memory, and the mind's done its own sorts of little tricks and worked its best way to sort of stick it in a box and put it away and forget about it. So actually you have to sort of work with the person to identify what that key event was. And then what we get them to do is to identify, there'll be a story to it, it'll have a level of meaning, and we help them to connect with that. And then while we get them to reflect upon that event and what it means to them, what it says to them, we get them to re-engage in eye movements. So in a one-on-one, we get them to look at watching the therapist's finger goes back and forth across their face, so their eyes are going from side to side. Or we can get them to watch a computer screen where a light goes from side to side. And the reason why we need to do this is to stimulate both sides of the brain. So that's its body therapy component to it. We can even use tapping on our hands, so tapping the left hand and the right hand, or we can use sound, so clicking in the left ear, clicking in the right ear. But what happens is while they're holding that image in their mind and engaging in that, what we call this bilateral stimulation, the memory starts to get processed again. Now, the really important part of that is it's now, quite some years later or some time later, you've often got the wisdom of that person being able to look back, and you've got the wisdom and the support of the person doing it with you to actually help you move through that traumatic experience. Once it's processed, the mind's actually able to put that whole issue to bed, release that energy, and resolution, starts to follow shortly thereafter. Now, of course, if it happened a long time ago, there'll be other memories that need to be identified and work your way back to the present moment. But that's essentially it. You're going to take an old memory where something traumatic happened, help the person to move through it, process through it, and the brain does the rest.
Yeah. Yeah. So is this a practice that you actually use when you work with your clients?
Absolutely, yeah. It's a wonderful technique because we now know. I mean, it's been around for more than 25 years. It was originally designed to work with Vietnam vets, so you don't really get much more traumatic than what happens in a theatre of war.
Sure.
And these were guys that had been really engaged in therapy for many, many, many years, and really the results that began to occur with even in 6 sessions for these really traumatic guys was just remarkable. Now, having said that, if you've got a really complicated, long entrenched trauma, it can take some time to still work through it. But what the research has found is that using a technique like EMDR is much, much, much faster than just talking about it.
And I know EMDR has been around for about, like you say, 25 years, and there's 60,000 registered EMDR practitioners around the world. So obviously they've developed a lot of statistical kind of studies to back this. So you find in your own work that there's a statistically significant base for when you do this work, as opposed to the talking therapy, that a trauma will get relieved.
Well, definitely what it becomes is one of your main tools in your toolbox. So of course you engage with the talking therapy, then having identified it, here's an opportunity where EMDR will work, you then apply that process. So definitely.
Okay, I just want people are asking, as we're saying EMDR, what does EMDR stand for? EMDR is a therapy technique that Paul uses and many other psychologists use to help relieve past trauma. That's EMDR is an acronym. It stands for Eye Movement Desensitization Reprocessing. And so what Paul is saying is that by using this technique, EMDR, you're able to take a past trauma, which is what we've been talking about, and release it, relieve it, and be able to move forward. Now, my question for you, Paul, is what happens when somebody does have an effective release through one of these techniques such as EMDR? Let's say they've got a weight problem and it was triggered as a result of some past trauma. We do this process. What happens next?
Yeah, well, as I said, the person had talked beforehand about food being the door to their emotional healing. So the food brought them in, and then actually getting the opportunity to work through these issues. They found that their whole level of arousal changed. The whole way that their brain regulated their arousal changed. So they were. It played a cornerstone role in not driving them to go to the fridge or not driving them to actually be looking for that food. So, what I found in working this past year in this field with the weight loss is that everybody absolutely gets and benefits straight away from those mechanical components of putting all those super nutritious foods into the system. But sometimes despite that, there's still this body's need, to sort of hang on to that weight because it's just not sure yet whether it's safe. It's still scared. So once this emotional component starts to be addressed, then it's like the mind can finally send the message to the body, it's okay now. And so the enhancements come right across that person's life, including the need now for the permission for the body to now start to lose that weight. It doesn't need to hold it anymore.
That to me is amazing. I mean, obviously it's something I've lived through. It's something we've seen so many times coaching with people that, yeah, we get them started on the superfoods and the nutrition, but when there's an emotional release, it's just unbelievable. And as we've been doing this first set of coaching that we did before we started this ultimate coaching experience that we're about to embark on, we had this test run coaching program called the case study, and what we found, I don't know if you've seen this, and we all saw this, is that there would be this process of maybe a month or two where people are feeling great, having more energy, but not much is changing other than that, and then all of a sudden they'll have this big emotional release, and the weight's just falling off, and they're just saying, I'm not hungry anymore, I don't know what's going on, my patterns have changed. Were you experiencing that also? Were you finding that?
Definitely. And as I said, and to go back to what that person said about pain, and one of the ladies I found, she was amazed that her arthritic, her joint pain just went away.
That's
it's
amazing.
Like, and these things, they're always a beautiful surprise, but it's just amazing how the body shifts and then reconfigures once these traumas and these fears have been worked through.
Yeah. So I just want to backstep a second, because a lot of people are asking the question, how do we find that original trigger, that original trauma? Because it's not always clear. Obviously, in the case of abuse, or a car accident or something like mugging, it's obvious. But for a lot of people, it isn't obvious. They know there's an emotional component. Maybe they're just really, really stressed out. Maybe it's something their father said to them when they were 3 years old. Like, how do you find that? And if you can't find it, like, what do you do about that?
Well, generally what will happen is a person will come in with something that's happened, maybe recently, and they've noticed a pattern over a period of time. So their boss chewed them out and they got really, really upset and really, really, really lost or really angry. And so they've come to the person to actually have a chat about that. But then in the process of discussing, we find that if we ask them to reflect back, they say, well, I also remember that happening back here and back there. And if we ask them to even reflect back on, when was the first time somebody really chewed you out and you had that reaction? Oh, wow, well, that happened when I was like 18. And so we generally find that the most recent thing that's brought the person in actually is connected through a chain of events, a chain of memory events, if you like, back to what that original touchstone memory can be.
The touchstone memory. So somebody comes in for a session and they're upset about their boss or something, and you want to do an EMDR practice with them. The first thing you're going to do is keep going back and back until you can find the closest thing to that touchstone original incident, and then you're going to work on that. Is that how it works?
Definitely. So you're going to go as close as you can. You might not get back there on the first, few goes. It just has to. So many things can happen, but anything that you do to start getting that mind, to start looking at that event and looking at those sequences where there's a similarity. Because remember, the mind's amazing. It wants to actually achieve homeostasis. It doesn't like being stressed out either. So it's going to learn. So if you actually create even a shift even in the present, sometimes people can only work in that very recent stuff. That's okay. That's okay. That's the starting process. There'll be a little bit of a ripple effect.
That's perfect. Listen, Paul, I've got Jenny. She wants to chime in. She's just getting questions through the roof. So she's demanding that I bring her in right now. Jenny, it's all you.
Just a couple of good ones here that fit in. And Leslie says, while sexual abuse may have started the ball rolling, just being a fat toddler, a child or an adolescent, an adult in a fat-hating world is an ongoing trauma. Which techniques are best for this type of essential bullying by individuals, loved ones, and society at large?
Okay, before you answer that, Paul, Jenny, just pull your headset back just a little bit. There's a little bit of air coming through. But go ahead, Paul.
Yeah, what I'm going to do is I'm going to actually address that one with mindfulness, because there is this ongoing world that we have to interact with that does have a whole bunch of opinions, and some of those opinions aren't terribly supportive of where we are at this moment, especially when those opinions are based generally in a state of ignorance and not understanding. So there are ways that we can also interact with the world, interact with our stress, to help us have a different relationship with that stress and a different relationship with those uncomfortable and events in the world. So I will definitely come back into that when I talk about mindfulness.
Hey, Jen, stay with us 1 second. So let's go to that. All right, let's go to that right now, because I know that you're mindfulness practice and you're a mindfulness meditation teacher. Let's start talking that a little bit before we take Jenny's next question. Okay. So just describe what that is and why that's important.
Mindfulness is about bringing our awareness to the present moment. Now, what happens is, and this is for everybody, and there's really good reasons why this happens, but we continually oscillate between the past and the future. We have regrets, we replay stressful events that are in the past, we worry about the future. So a typical example is, we have an argument with somebody that we love or someone who's important to us during the day. We wake up at 2 o'clock in the morning, and the first thing we actually pops into our head is the argument or the event. Now, so straight away we're back in the past. Sometimes what we'll try and do is even replay the argument in 7 different ways and see ourselves winning it. But invariably we go back over it and we re-experience. And the thing for the poor old body is the body can't tell the difference between the past and the future. So it actually thinks that fight is happening again, and once again it starts to produce all those stress hormones. Because then the person is worried about, they can't get back to sleep, they've got to go to work in the morning, they're going to feel terrible, so then they're in the future. And then as they worry about being tired tomorrow, then they're back in the past blaming the person they had the argument with because it's their fault that they're going to be waking up tired. And they're never in this present moment. They're always oscillating between the past and the future. Yet true acceptance and true peace only can ever arise in the present moment.
Can I just comment on that one point, because I think it's a brilliant point, and that is that when you're really, really in the present moment, you're always in a relaxed state, because as you said, the fear from a mental perspective and an emotional perspective, the fear is always in the past and the future. So I agree with you 100% that if you can train yourself to be right here, right now, there's no fear right here, right now. The fear is going to happen or happen. So how do we do that? How do we train ourselves to be right here, right now, in a habitual sense?
Yeah. Look, there's a lot of amazing techniques out there now. Mindfulness is one of the biggest areas of research in the scientific literature, although really, it's been around for thousands of years. You can take any of the main philosophies and you'll find that the wise old sages of old have talked about the eternal present, the ability to come back, to be the calm in the eye of the storm. These are beautiful analogies. And we've just forgotten about it. No one's told us about these amazing things that we can do. But what we do know, just to sort of, why would we bother coming back to the present moment? Well, to come back to that amazing neocortex I was talking about beforehand, we now know that if people practice just becoming present, so that's aware of your awareness, for 20 minutes a day, just in 8 weeks, we can actually see the architectural changes in the brain on a brain scan. And I mean, we're talking about, we used to think the brain was set in stone, but we now know it's so amazingly pliable and flexible. And why would you do that? Well, we now know that that part of that brain which sits over your eyebrows has the ability to settle down that amygdala, to actually create a state of beautiful regulation and calmness, okay, to turn off those stress hormones. So the very practice of regularly becoming present changes the brain architecture in a way that then helps the person's body to become less stressed. And sorry, go.
Yeah, so the important take-home point here, as I'm listening to this, is that if you make an effort to do mindfulness practices, what happens is it doesn't become an effort anymore. You've rewired your brain chemistry so that you're more in the present and less in that fearful state. As you said in the beginning, the more you activate the amygdala, the more it gets activated. It just becomes a reinforcing, self-regulating loop where you're more and more reacting to it. So what you're saying, it sounds to me like, is if you do a specific practice every day, after a while, it's not an effort. It's just that your brain's been rewired. Is that what you're saying?
That's exactly right. That's why your visualizations are such a powerful tool, because one of the things we know with brain architecture is that repetition is king. Okay, so just practicing. So what might start out on day one as a state, it's a state of consciousness. I'm just going to actually mindfully become aware of my breath for the next 2 minutes. That's just a state. But if you practice it enough, it becomes a trait, becomes a part of the way your brain then reacts to the situations that you present to it. So when people are practicing your visualizations, John, they're actually stimulating, a part of the brain on a regular basis, which is actually strengthening it and making it more effective at dealing with the issues that they want to get dealt with.
I think that's why we, in the coaching that we're doing over the last 6 months, that we hear people say, I can never go back to the way I was. Have you heard people say that?
Yeah, definitely.
I can't tell you how many people have said to me, look, I don't care about anything else. I could never, ever go back to who I was or the way I was. And I think that's because we really, really emphasize doing just a 5-minute visualization every morning, and it's become so solid in their life as such a solid habit that it's permeated every aspect of their life in the form of kind of mindfulness and positive habits and less stress. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, there are just so many. Yeah, sorry, go.
Yeah. Go ahead, Paul. I'm sorry. I just got excited.
Yeah, it's just that there are so many beautiful things that arise from this practice, and the other one is, which has such a role to play for people that I've worked with that are carrying extra weight, and that is compassion. Right? Because often, people have been exposed to lots of, very mean comments, tough situations, and to actually begin that process of compassion, to build that compassion towards themselves and their body, is also part of that healing journey. And that's one of the things we know from all the data, all the studies. The practicing mindfulness increases your capacity to feel compassion, and that's compassion for yourself and compassion for not only the people that we love in our life, but actually the people that are actually not so kind to us. Because we're in the traffic, someone cuts us off. We've got a choice. We can actually curse them and think all sorts of unkind things, which basically puts us into that fight or flight stage.
Yeah.
or you can actually have a different relationship with that moment in time.
Yeah.
And see it from a higher perspective of, that person's just ignorant, or who knows what happened to them today, whatever, and have a different experience, and our body doesn't get stressed then.
So you've got a couple of suggestions for how to be mindful that I know we could talk about, like listening to the sounds around you. I wonder if you could sort of guide us in like something that we could do right now or when we get off the phone that can help get us started in rewiring our brain circuitry this way.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's often a very interesting exercise for people to literally just try for like even 1 minute to just see how many thoughts pop into their head. You can sort of like be this cat at a mouse hole, just watching and then counting the thoughts as they arise. And within 1 or 2 minutes, it can be quite amazing how many thoughts have actually come to the surface. And then the next thing they realize is, wow, where's the button? How do I turn this sucker off? Well, the thing is, what we get people to do is not fight those thoughts. Is to actually know that that's a normal part of the mind's processing, to let them arise. And so we begin to find ways to simply observe them and bring ourselves to, and then we use any sort of modality we like. So if we're actually in the park, for example, if we just took just a couple of minutes to just simply tune into all the sounds that we can hear. And what we get people to do is actually not identify the sounds. So they might go, oh, that's that's a car, or that's that's the wind through the leaves. Once they start this process, we get them to acknowledge the experience of the sound without the label. So they sort of label it, and we go, just let the label go, because that's a thought. So that label is a thought, and it has a story. If they hear a dog barking, it might remind them of the other day at 2 o'clock in the morning when the neighbour's dog was keeping them up all night. Whereas they can experience that dog's bark as even a series of interesting, sounds and harmonics. This is what we do when we teach people about pain. Pain has a story as soon as we label it. But if we actually get them to experience a strong physical sensation, or just a sensation, and to observe it, then we find that whole sensation changes. So the things that people can do is just, they can go for that walk in the park and really experience it. So feel their feet on the ground, smell the actual whatever they can be aware of. Feel the sun, the temperature on their face. Really experience it. If they're in the car, why do people get stressed when there's a set of traffic lights? It's because they're stuck in the meeting that's occurring in the future. When they've got an opportunity right there, there's nothing you can do about the reality of being at the traffic lights. So there's an opportunity here to actually feel the steering wheel, to actually, and I would recommend that people actually turn the radio off, because it's just a whole bunch of other thoughts as well. So either tune into the ambient music, or even just tune into the surroundings visually.
So I know, when we work with people, we usually tell them to take like a stress break in the afternoon. So maybe just 5 minutes, go for a walk in the park. That would be a really, really good time to practice this sort of mindfulness practice. Is that right?
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, even walking across to the park, feel your feet. Become aware of, because people don't do this. They just don't. They just walk. But actually feel your feet as you walk. Listen to the sound that your feet make as they walk across the pavement towards the park. Begin to experience the moment right there, because every time you become aware of yourself in the present moment, you fire up this mid-prefrontal cortex and you start building new brain architecture.
Yeah.
So it's really, there's no downside to this.
So basically what you're doing when you're working with people, which I think is brilliant, is number one, you're reprocessing and resolving the issue that's causing our brain to stimulate the fear centers. And then you're creating some positive connections to the parts of our brain. It's really fascinating. You're creating positive connections to that part of our brain that creates pleasure, calmness, safety. Is that what you're doing?
Yeah, that's exactly right. You summed it up.
It's beautiful. It's basically, people come in with all these issues, but really you're kind of like an architect that's restructuring the shape and connectivity of our processing centers. I love it. It's really beautiful. We're running a little bit short on time, so I just want to bring Jenny in for a couple more questions before we have to go, because I know people are busy. So Jen, are you there?
Yes.
Okay.
I'll just go back to a couple of comments, not so much questions before we go too far, because I think these were worthwhile. And one of them was, Kerry says that soundstrue.com has some amazing resources, and she's brought some great meditation stuff through them.
Jen, just speak up a little bit. We lost you for just in that last bit.
Soundstrue.com has some amazing resources. She's brought some great meditation stuff through there. And another comment was that the acknowledgement in the conscious mind of these subconscious triggers helps a lot in the release as we are reflecting from a different perspective, and sometimes we realize how trivial that one conversation should have been in the overview of a whole life.
That makes a lot. That makes a lot of sense.
And another comment was, I think it would be interesting to add to the therapies used, Gestalt therapy, for it works liberating emotions from trauma, working with present emotions and sensations in the body. It works also with the part of the person that can't stop eating, and you can identify with emotional triggers.
What do you think of that, Paul?
Yeah, Gestalt therapy is another great therapy. I mean, as I said right at the beginning, you know, hats off to anybody who actually takes the step to actually engage any sort of additional therapy to target these emotional components, because you know, it's probably at least 50% of the equation, just connecting that there's this link, and you've finally got to a point in your life where you feel safe enough and comfortable enough to go and take that next step. But yeah, Gestalt therapy has some great benefits too.
I think you're right, Paul. I think the take-home message here, the most important thing, is to make the connection between between your weight problems and stress and trauma, to first make that connection and start going in certain directions. Now, you and I have been looking for the best techniques and the best way to solve emotional issues for many years, and I think we're getting really good at it. But the real take-home message is you've got to look in this direction. So we are running out of time here, so I just want to thank everyone for joining the class today. As you know, Paul and I are about to begin a very intense coaching period called the Ultimate Coaching Program, and we're doing these webinars so that we can give you as much time as we can until we start, but we are starting it very soon. And this program is by application only, and if you think it might be a good fit, you can have a look at the program to learn more about it. It's at thegabrielmethod.com/ultimate. As I mentioned, we just have a few spots left, but if you're interested, go ahead and apply. Somebody will contact you within a week and have a conversation with you. But basically, the way the coaching works is that myself, Paul, many other coaches that specialize in different areas like nutrition and exercise physiology, we're going to be customizing your experience. We're going to be trying to understand what are your fat triggers and be able to identify your fat triggers and give you real solutions.